Hi everyone and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. Before we begin, can I just say if you do enjoy this story, please do give it a thumbs up and please do subscribe to the channel if you'd like to hear more stories like this one or stories about the history of the Northeast. Please do feel free to share this video if you think others might enjoy it too. This is a somewhat sad and tragic case of George Clark, who was found guilty of murdering Mark Frater in Newcastle upon Tyne on October the 1st, 1861. It would appear the whole thing started because of a dog licence. George Clark would later prove to be not of sound mind. This is his story. Little or nothing is known of the early life of George Clark. At the time of the trial, George stated that he was 45 years old, though he did often change his age. However, both at the time of his arrest and during the trial, it was stated by others that he was not believed to be more than 35 years of age, so it's almost impossible to get a clear and true idea of his actual age. There are few details of his family. It is not made clear if his mother was still alive. He did have a stepsister called Elizabeth, but she is not mentioned at the trial. His early life is quite simply a bit of a mystery. He was a cabinet maker by trade and he lived in what was classed as St Nicholas's churchyard in Newcastle with his dog. This would have been a home more or less for a pauper. It was also discussed in one article that he had used his dog previously for dog fights, but I didn't find a lot of evidence to back this up, so I cannot confirm if it is true or not. But it was a quite common thing back in the 1800s. He was described by many who knew him, including those who he worked with, as being rather eccentric. Mark Frater, the victim, was born in Rothbury in around 1805 to parents William and Margaret. He married Mary Ann in around 1830 and they had one daughter. Mary Ann died in around 1848 and Mark went on to marry Hannah in 1850 and they had two sons together. It was said that Mark Frater had established an omnibus service from Gosforth to Newcastle in around 1857. This service ran from Bulman Village, the area where Mr. Frater lived, to the monument in Newcastle. It was said to be a very regular service, and it was also said that this bus service came long before the tram service in the area. Mark was said to have had several jobs during his working life, including one as an office clerk for the Newcastle Chronicle, but he had most recently taken a job as a tax collector in Newcastle, and it was because of this job that he came into contact with George Clark. Mark was described as a gentleman, always willing to help as much as he could. It would appear that in March of 1861, Mark had given notice to George that he needed to pay his half-yearly dog licence fee of 6 shillings. Although it was said that George had previously paid, though he often delayed payment, on this occasion he was unwilling to pay. So Mark had warned him that his goods would be seized if he did not make the payment and that they would be kept until he did pay. Although it's not totally clear why George refused to pay, there seemed to be some issue with the Queen, and George is said to have written to her to ask her if she received the dog licence money, and although he claimed she replied to him personally, it's highly unlikely that she did. He claimed that she had told him that she did not receive the money herself, and this seemed to be one reason why he refused to pay. In May of 1861, George Clark's woodworking tools were seized by Mark Frater, as he had still not paid his licence and was still refusing to do so. The loss of his tools had really angered him, and it would seem that he then started to plot his revenge on Mark Frater. It's unclear what George Clark was doing without his tools, but he was still in employment, working for the same company that he had always worked for, and it was not until October of 1861 that his so-called revenge took place. On the morning of October the 1st, 1861, Mark Frater had arrived in Newcastle by his usual means of transport from his home in Gosforth, and he was walking towards his office in Blackett Street in the company of a Mr. Horne who he had met at Northumberland Street. The two men stopped near Mark's offices and talked for a few moments. It was then said that out of nowhere George Clark appeared. He lunged forward and struck Mark Frater in the neck with a knife. George and Mark struggled for a few minutes, and when Mark managed to move away from George, Mr. Horne said he noticed he was holding his hand to his neck and that blood was pouring onto his clothes and from between his fingers. He then made to go into his office away from George. George by then had been detained by passers-by who had also taken the knife from him. Mark barely had time to enter his office and sit in a chair before he sadly died from the wounds inflicted to his neck. George was taken to the police station where he was quickly arrested by Sergeant Anderson for wilful murder, and he was heard to say, "I murdered him, he robbed me, and I robbed him back." The inquest on the body of Mark Frater was at Manners Police Court. The coroner was a Mr. J.S. Hoyle. George Clark was said to be indifferent about the situation he found himself in. The knife used in the crime was produced and was said to be bent out of shape, which had occurred, according to the witnesses, during the attack. George was said to be making rambling statements and interrupting the proceedings with many incoherent mumblings. Mr. James MacDonald was called as a witness. He worked with George, and he said for some time George had been saying he would get his revenge on Mr. Frater and that he would murder him. It was at this point that George then shouted out, "There's no point in listening to an old wife like that." His outburst was directed at James MacDonald. It was also stated that George had for a short time worked at Newcastle prison, where he had told people, "I will soon be in here myself, to be hung for murder." The jury at the inquest retired for less than a minute before returning a verdict of guilty of wilful murder, and George was committed for trial. The funeral of Mark Frater took place on Friday the 4th of October at Jesmond Cemetery, which we now refer to as Jesmond Old Cemetery. The hearse, followed by 4 mourning coaches, travelled from his family home in Gosforth. It was said that crowds had gathered at the entrance to the cemetery. Many were said to be deeply affected by the sorrowful scene. The funeral service itself was for family only, and Mark was buried alongside his first wife, Mary Ann. The photos on screen at the moment are the actual headstone belonging to Mark Frater and his family, which I recently went to see. Although it is quite worn in places, I hope you are able to make out the details, but if you can't, it simply states, "The above Mark Frater died October the 1st, 1861, aged 56 years. It was quite strange standing beside the grave of the man whose story I had been researching. The trial of George Clark took place at Newcastle Assizes in February of 1862 before Mr. Justice Wiles. The majority of the trial covers the details that I have already mentioned, such as what people saw on the day of the incident, what George did and what they did, so I won't repeat them. However, it is worth mentioning the behaviour of George Clark during the trial and a couple of other things that were not discussed at the inquest. It seems the court had expected George to plead insanity. However, he pleaded not guilty and refused counsel, wishing to defend himself. His main defence was that Mark Frater had stabbed himself and that he had simply been there at the time and had taken the knife from him. Mr. Horne had been asked if he at any time had seen Mark Frater with a knife, and he said he had not. Another witness was asked if he had thought it was possible that Mr. Frater had inflicted the wounds upon himself, to which he had replied, no, it was not possible. However, George did not seem to have any other defence and still continued to stick with this theory. George repeatedly interrupted both the judge and the witnesses, and at one time he was asked to be quiet, otherwise he would be removed. This did not deter him, and he frequently shouted, "Hear, hear," or asked the witnesses to sit down. He simply seemed to have no control over his outbursts. He spent some considerable time arguing with one witness about where Mark and Mr. Horn had been standing on the morning that the crime took place. He seemed to feel the need to disagree with what everyone was saying. The judge did make inquiries with one or two witnesses as to their opinion of his state of mind. It was said that whilst one witness believed he knew exactly what he was doing at the time of the murder, he also believed him to be of diseased mind, or in simple terms, that he felt him to be insane, and that his opinion about George had not changed at any time. The chaplain of the prison was also asked how he saw his state of mind, and he relayed a story of George asking him to kneel and pray with him, whereupon he had then started to sing a rambling song, and the prison chaplain had got up and left. This gave him the opinion that George was not of sound mind. The trial continued until the end, although you have to wonder why it was not stopped, as it surely must have been clear to those present that George Clark was not fit to represent himself. George Clark, however, addressed the judge and jury with his closing statement. It was said to be rambling, at times incoherent, and mostly not relevant to the case in hand. He talked again about the Queen and many other subjects, but not really any that gave a clear reason as to why he should not be found guilty of the crime of murder. The judge then summed up, and the jury retired for some 2¼ hours before returning a verdict of guilty of wilful murder. The judge then passed a sentence of death by hanging on George Clark, who responded by telling the judge that he was a good old wife. It does seem to have been clear to some that George was not of sound mind. A respite was received from the Home Office in order that he could be assessed, and Mr. J.G. Perry was authorised to visit and examine George Clark. He also visited his previous workplace and was also able to obtain details relating to George's mother. It was said that she had previously claimed relief money on the grounds of her son being insane. These details had not been disclosed at the trial. Mr. Perry reported that he was not in the slightest doubt that George was indeed insane and had been so for many years. It was due to this report that the death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. I have found a few details about George after this time. He was sent from Newcastle to Millbank Prison in Middlesex, and from arriving he had been confined to the infirmary. It is here that his stepsister was said to have visited him, but there are no details about her visit. By May of 1862 he was recommended for the lunatic asylum in Salisbury called the Fisherton Asylum. This was classed as a convict lunatic asylum. On screen at the moment is an abstract from an article written by William Gilbert in 1864. It is actually a conversation that he had with George Clark. His own account of the event of the murder some 3 years later is clearly remembered incorrectly. I was quite amazed to find this article and felt it really did need to be part of this story. How long he remained in the asylum is unknown, and there are no details of his death or where he may have been buried. It seems that the end of his life was just as mysterious as his childhood. I can't help wondering if this had happened these days, would George have ever stood trial, or would he have been simply classed as insane and sent to a secure hospital? Or more so, would it be hoped that he would never have been able to reach the stage where he would kill someone over something so trivial? As it is, this is another sad and tragic story, such a simple problem of a dog licence not being paid that led to the loss of the life of a well-respected member of the community. If you have enjoyed this story, please do give it a thumbs up, and please do subscribe to the channel if you would like to hear more stories like this one. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you again very soon.